Wicked problems need to be channeled through multi-stakeholder processes or partnerships. No single actor is able to solve the issue on his or her own.
Hello, this is Somaya Dehban, a passionate Dutchified Iranian who is rather obsessed with impact measurement, cross-sector partnerships, and scale-up. I am the creator and host of Scale Your Impact, a podcast for anyone who has an interest in understanding and measuring impact and figuring out how to scale the effectiveness of cross-sector partnerships to achieve the 2030 Agenda of the United Nations. Join me every first Tuesday of the month to hear about the articles I have read or written on these subjects and beyond. Now let's partner up to measure this episode of Scale Your Impact.
Welcome to the third episode of Scale Your Impact. Thank you for showing up and tuning in. This may be the third episode of this podcast series, but it is the 9th podcast that I have recorded since I started my podcast work in October. You may know that beside Scale Your Impact, I have 3 other podcasts, each of which in one way or another is related to Scale Your Impact. When I started these podcast series and their dedicated newsletters, I wanted to show the interconnectedness of different subjects and how addressing one issue requires addressing several other issues. To keep you updated with the other podcasts and show the interconnectedness between each of these topics, on quarterly basis, I share with you a summary of what has been discussed and how they are related to each other. In this episode, I talk about wicked problems, which is also the title of this episode. Many of the people who are not in the domain of sustainable development goals are not familiar with the term wicked problems. So I hope this is a useful introduction for you. In the following segment, I introduce you to wicked problems. As my reference, I use the publication of my PhD supervisor, Professor Rob van Tulder, from Rotterdam School of Management, Erasmus University. Wicked Problems Plaza, which is published in 2016 by Partnership Resource Center, introduces wicked problems as follows. An increasingly interconnected world is faced with a lengthy list of grand challenges, including poverty, access to water, climate change, and financial crisis. At the same time, the world is faced with unprecedented opportunities. Technological innovations are reaching all corners of the world. So systematic crises and global opportunities appear at the same time. Both the complexity and the interdependence of the global system have clearly increased. Similarly, there is increased uncertainty on the course that developments will take and the kind of solutions that need to be developed. Society is confronted with wicked problems, issues that are difficult to define and can be assessed as either problems or opportunities. The world faces many of these wicked problems, but it is also more than ever able to address them. This is the basic paradox of today. Wicked problems cannot be solved. They actually resist definition. For these problems, there are no single or simple solution available. Wicked problems need to be channeled through multi-stakeholder processes or partnerships. No single actor is able to solve the issue on his or her own. The best one can do is to define more or less adequate pathways to address the wicked problems. There is evidence that many processes of multi-stakeholder engagement do not really deliver the intended results or address the actual problem. We can identify multiple reasons for this. There can be a limited fit of the partnership with the problem, a limited understanding of the challenge, or not enough creativity in the chosen aims of the partnership. The vital question for addressing wicked problems thus becomes, how can we create conditions for multi-stakeholder dialogues in which coalitions and partnerships can be constructed that can deal with the wickedness of the problems and the opportunities that they entail? And this question is also at the core of my PhD research, where I explore the ways to enhance or upscale the impact of cross-sector partnerships. I also developed a model called verbinding, the Dutch term for interconnectedness, to facilitate the process of coalition building and partnership development and scaling. This model was presented on 30th of October in Academiegebouw of Utrecht University. If you've signed up for one of my newsletters, you have received information about it. Now that we talked about wicked problems, let's talk about the topics that I presented in my other podcasts. Every second Tuesday of the month, you can listen to Your Native Analyst, where I share my analysis on selected political affairs around the world, specifically in Iran, Middle East, European Union, and the Netherlands. I explore and contextualize issues that are usually not picked up by the mainstream media. On the first episode of this podcast series, I discussed how addressing the complex situation in the Middle East and Iran also requires a complex approach. I noticed a gap in the information that is provided by the mainstream media to the non-natives who follow the news about Iran and, by the extension, the Middle East. Of course, with all the technology available, we can have the news translated from any language to our native language by artificial intelligence. However, what is missed out in these translations, or better to say, what is lost in translation, is the underlying nuance. And in many cases, if not all, the underlying nuance is where the actual news is left. I also mentioned that as a liberal, I believe in personal rights and responsibilities. In 1999, a group of opinion leaders under sponsorship of UNESCO introduced a draft for Declaration of Human Duties and Responsibilities, which was not endorsed. The declaration is what I advocate for because it is based on active and proactive motives of individuals, companies, and governments. In my PhD research, as you may recall from the first episode, I focus on 3 catalysts for accelerating the progress towards 2030 agenda. The first catalyst is the positioning and motives of civil society organizations at the local and international level as not merely implementers of international development, but also as agents of change that play an active role in the balanced society. This catalyst is also based on the approach of rights and responsibilities. Our development aid approaches are at best rights-based, and I believe without the inclusion of responsibility in our approaches, we would never achieve the true sustainability. In the second episode of Your Native Analyst, I talked about the complexity of the Iranian political system. I used a sort of a metaphor to describe this complex and wicked problem. I compared the political system of Iran to a mule, which is an inbreed of horse and donkey. I discussed how this inbreed system has taken elements from various political systems, yet does not really fit into any of the political systems known previously. I added that, like a mule, political system of Iran is stronger, more stubborn, and more resistant than its parents. yet also like a mule, it cannot reproduce itself and will not give rise to a new generation. And like a mule, it can be quite unpredictable when put under pressure. My other podcast that comes out every third Tuesday of the month is called Your Funding Network, where I explore innovative fundraising for community-based activities and discover how we can exit development aid and move towards a truly sustainable international development sector. By the description of it, I bet you feel the connection it has with my PhD. Both of them are related to sustainable development. To exit development aid, which in my opinion is one of the byproducts of Agenda 2030, we need to make our development aid programs community-based center, and as a result, the financing required for their sustainability should also come from the community as well. The development aid was meant as a temporary solution, and I delved into this subject in the first episode of Your Funding Network. In the same episode, I talked about my mother's legendary work as a community-based fundraiser and how collectively, together with her neighbors, local shop owners, and local authorities, she built one of the biggest sports centers in her community. In the second episode of Your Funding Network, I talked about 6 main questions and issues that needs to be addressed for every fundraising effort, from understanding the meaning of fundraising to whose responsibility is fundraising and where do we find the money. I also talked about fundraising methods and what needs to be in place before we raise funds effectively. And lastly, how to take our efforts to the next level. And on every 4th Tuesday of the month, you can listen to Your Curated Kin, where I delve into the personal side of my story about being in exile, being a mother, and being an equal partner. I also share about my creative work, from poetry and stories of my upbringing to Persian fusion food and handcrafts. In the first episode of this podcast series, I shared why and how I ended up living in exile and how the community with whom I had no blood relations became my safety network and my family. And again, how my liberal values have impacted me in taking the responsibility to build my network and how a change should come from within. In the second episode, I talked about how we can close the gender gap by valuing parenthood as a social function. And this is exactly how the UN Convention on Women's Rights, CEDAW, has described motherhood. In this episode, I also shared an anecdote of how my younger son perceives relations. For him, the blood relations, the ethnic or religious backgrounds are not the integral elements of our relations. The connections and the relations we make with each other are at the core of our verbinding, which is the Dutch term again for interconnectedness. And the link between this podcast series and the others are again at the point of interconnectedness. At an individual level, as mentioned in Your Curated Kin, at community level, as mentioned in Your Funding Network, and at national and international level, as mentioned in Your Native Analyst and Scale Your Impact. This was the last episode of Scale Your Impact in 2021. I want to take the opportunity again to thank you for tuning in every first Tuesday of the month and listening to my podcast. And if you're celebrating the Christmas holidays, I want to wish you a wonderful time with your loved ones. And if 1st of January is the beginning of your new year, I want to say Happy New Year. May this year be a year of scaling and thriving for you, your loved ones, and your organization. I feel quite blessed and privileged to have the opportunity to celebrate the new year twice a year. Once on 1st of January, and I have been celebrating this occasion for the last 16 years since I moved to the Netherlands, and once on the first day of spring, which is usually around 21st of March, and it's the time that day and night are of equal length. This celebration is based on my Persian heritage. In the March 2022 episode of Your Curated Kin, I will talk about this celebration more in detail. And if you want to hear more about another Persian tradition, listen to the December episode of Your Curated Kin to know how Iranians prepare for winter. In each of these episodes, I also talk about how we can scale our way of life to be prepared for what life may bring us.
What was the scaling moment of this episode for you? Did you hear about something that impacted your understanding of what impact really means? I hope you gained a deeper insight into the complexity of impact measurement and impact scale-up. Also learned something about the importance of cross-sector partnerships to accelerate the progress towards achieving sustainable development goals. Want to hear more? Sign up for my thematic newsletters to get notified about each episode and more. You can do this by going to my website, somayedehban.com/newsletters. Until the next partnering, Bedrood.